Hi everyone. In this video, I want to briefly talk about chapter 9, which is about unemployment and inflation. We will learn about how we can basically define and calculate unemployment rate as well as inflation rate. Um, so unemployment rate and even inflation rate are two important economic indicators for measuring the standard of living. We talked about another also indicator that measures the standard of living in chapter 7, which was a real GDP, or if you want to be more precise, real GDP per capita. In this chapter, we will talk about two other economic indicators, unemployment rate as well as inflation rate. Okay. Now let's see how basically in United States we can calculate unemployment rate and how the institution which is in charge of reporting and collecting all the data is basically calculating and coming up with the numbers that we see on the news and on their website. First of all, the institution in charge is called Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS. And if you ever want to to basically um, learn about the current unemployment rate, you can just Google BLS and it will take you to Bureau of Labor Statistic website where they update basically each month unemployment rate, cost of living, all the other information that is related basically to the job market. It's a huge institution and they actually, as I said, they report all these information and all these data every single month. So they are super active. Every single month, they collect basically data. They, as you can see here, they have this survey, which is called Current Population Survey. They go basically door to door to 60,000 households, and they fill out actually their survey by asking about the age of the people in the household, their gender, if they have a full-time job, part-time job, are they on sick leave or not, if they are not working, what is the reason that they are unemployed. So they gather all this information and then they bring it back to Bureau of Labor Statistics. And they are basically interested in population that are 16 years old and older, because they are going actually to work with this category and they're going to divide this category into employed and unemployed. And of course, there are some people that might be 16 years old and older, but they're not in the labor force. And these are people who are, let's say, retired. They are full-time students and they do not have any job. They are 16 years old and older, and they belong to this category that we call it working age population. Um, but they are not in the labor force, okay? So with all the information that they collected, um, they are just going to be focused on working age population, which is 16 years old and older. And these are the people who are not in jail, they're not in hospital, they're not in any institutional care, and they are just going to be focused on this category. So if they have people that are 16 years or younger, they are not going to be working basically with those information and number. They're not really interested in that category, okay? So in the working age population, they are going actually to divide this working age population to labor force and not in the labor force. If you are in the labor force, as I showed you earlier, you are either employed or unemployed. And you might belong to the working age population, but be in the not in the labor force category. For instance, as I said, if you are a full-time student, if you're retired, if you're a homemaker, then you are not in the labor force. You still belong to the working age population, okay? But you are not in the labor force. If you are in the labor force, however, you are either employed or you are unemployed. And so the population basically we have in the labor force is coming from the number of people that are employed and the number of people that are unemployed. Of course, we're going to define what we mean by employed and unemployed in a second, but just remember these formulas. So this is how you can calculate labor force, because later on we're going to learn how to calculate unemployment rate, labor force participation rate. So you need to know how we calculate also the labor force. So remember that inside the labor force, you still have people that don't have a job, they are unemployed. So employed, according to Bureau of Labor Statistic, is basically a person who worked even for 1 hour for money in a week. For a paid job in a week of that they're doing their survey, okay, or they work for their family business or a family bakery or whatever on a farm or something for 15 hours, but they didn't get any money, but they're still counted as employed, okay. And also, at the time of the survey, they might come up with some people that they are not working at the moment, let's say because they are sick, because of pregnancy, because of winter storm that we had in Texas, because of weather. But they do have a job, but at the moment of the survey, they are not working, but they're still employed, okay? And remember, this is how we are defining employed in our country. It might be different in other countries, okay? So if you work for 1 hour for money or 15 hours for a family business, you are still employed. Unemployed, however, is a little bit tricky. Let me show you. So unemployed is when a person obviously don't have a job, but this part is very important. They should actively be looking for a job, especially at the time of the survey. They're going to ask you, okay, you are not working, but how long have you been looking for a job? And if you've been actively looking for a job, applying for different jobs, going to job interviews for the previous 4 weeks, you'll be in this category of unemployed. Okay. Or if you lost your job because you had, let's say, a seasonal job and you're just waiting to be recalled to work again. But at the moment you're not working, you are still in this category of unemployed. Okay. So you have to actively looking for a job if you are not working. So remember, we do have another category that I'm going to show you. I'm not sure if it's in the next slide or not, that they are not working, but they are not actively looking for a job. Let me bring it, it's here, but they are not actively looking for a job. They just gave up. This group of people, they are just tired of looking for a job, or they worked, they looked for a job, but they didn't find anything in the last 4 weeks of the survey. So we call them discouraged workers. Okay, the discouraged workers are not in that category of unemployed. Remember, okay. And one of the reasons that you can be skeptical about the numbers that you always see for unemployment rate is because of the discouraged worker, because they are not part of the calculation for unemployment rate. That I will show you the formula in a second. So the real unemployment rate, especially during recession time, is always higher than what the Bureau of Labor Statistics basically reports, because they do not count the discouraged workers. These are the people who are not still working, but they are not unemployed because they are not actively looking for a job. And we have many of them during recession times, because obviously we do not have enough jobs for everybody. So we have tons of discouraged workers, okay? So the actual unemployment rate can be higher than what we typically see, because we are not including the discouraged workers, okay? In this little formula here, this is how the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculate unemployment rate, and this is how they come up with the numbers on their website. So you should know this formula, but again, remember, for the test, you can always write them down, write all the formulas down. Just make sure you know how to calculate them, okay? So the unemployment rate is the number of basically unemployed divided by labor force. So that's the percentage of labor force that are not working, but they're actively looking for a job. Okay, so this is how they can calculate the unemployment rate. One thing, however, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is aware of this weakness that I was just talking about, not including the discouraged workers. So they come up actually with different types of categories for when it comes to calculating unemployment rate. So the official unemployment rate that they report doesn't include the discouraged workers, but they do calculate the unemployment rate with discouraged workers. You can go to their website and find it. They also report, let's say, the unemployment rate for male, for female, for different races. They can even calculate the unemployment rate for urban area, rural area, things like that. So that's not the only thing that they basically calculate. They can calculate the unemployment rate for many different populations. Okay. Um, it doesn't matter if you're a part-time worker or if you are a full-time worker, you will still be employed, because even if you're a part-time, according to their definition, you have to work at least 35 hours a week. But remember, at the time of the survey, if you work for just 1 hour, you'll be employed. Um, so that's how they are defining part-time workers. We have two different types of part-time workers. We have part-time workers that want to be part-time workers. It just matches with their lifestyle, with what's going on in their lives. So they choose actually become a part-time workers. But we also have many part-time workers that are just doing part-time jobs because they cannot find full-time jobs. So mainly, they are basically part-time workers because of the economic situation that's going on. And during recession times, we see actually the increase in the number of the part-time workers for the economic reasons. Okay. But the number of part-time workers that are part-time because of non-economic reasons is pretty stable over time. Okay, so during recession times, typically the number of these part-time workers of the second category actually increases a lot. Now let's talk about another economic indicator, which is called labor force participation rate. So unemployment rate is the percentage of labor force that are not basically employed, right? The labor force participation rate is percentage of working age population. Remember, in the working age population, we had people that are in the labor force. That are 16 years old and older, right? And we also have those group of people that are not in the labor force, right? So it is the percentage of working age population that are in the labor force. And again, in the labor force, remember, we have employed plus unemployed. Okay. So when we are talking, and this is the formula, again, you should know the formula. So remember one thing: when it comes to looking at a job market, always look at the unemployment rate and labor force participation rate at the same time. Then you can have a better idea about what's going on in the labor market, okay, in the job market. Because in the unemployment rate, you still have um, um, labor force, which is the combination of employed and unemployed. And in the labor force participation rate, you are basically including the people that are not basically working because of the way that we're defining labor force here. So in the labor force, you have employed and unemployed. Okay. In the unemployment rate, however, we're just focused on unemployed people. Okay. And what is the percentage of the labor force that are not working? But the labor force participation rate is telling you how many percentage of working age population are in the labor force. They could be employed or unemployed. Okay. This is just the data that I picked from Bureau of Labor Statistic. Of course, it's a little bit old. You can definitely check for more. And these were the data that I was talking about for male, for female. What basically is the gap between unemployment rate for these group of um, um, basically people. Another thing that we have in this chapter is about different types of unemployment. And your textbook actually has three types of unemployment, but I really like this classification of unemployment that I got it from other textbooks. So we have frictional unemployment, structural unemployment, seasonal and cyclical. Economists are not really worried about the frictional, structural, and seasonal unemployment because they are basically coming from natural changes, normal changes in the labor market, but the economies are definitely more concerned about the cyclical unemployment because in the cyclical unemployment, basically we have the group of people that are losing their jobs because of the changes in the business cycle. So the cyclical unemployment rate typically increases during recession time and goes down during expansion times. Okay, frictional unemployment. Is basically coming from the normal changes in the labor market. Okay, so people just leave the job market to find a better job. We have many jobs that are created one day, but they are not available the next day because of the changes in the labor market. Okay, good example is what I put here: a graduate student who is just looking for the first job. So this guy is dealing with frictional unemployment, but it's temporary. That's why economists are not really concerned about frictional unemployment. It's typically low and very, very normal. Because remember, even if the economy is doing well, and we will talk about it later, we will still have some level of unemployment rate, which is absolutely, absolutely normal and necessary for the economy. Okay. Another type of unemployment is called the structural unemployment, which is coming from the changes in technology, typically, and sometimes because of skills. So let's say at the time that the computers were created, many people didn't know how to use them. That's why they lost their job. But again, we're not concerned about this type of unemployment because as soon as you learn how to use with computer, you can find another job, right? So it's basically related to technology and competition skills that again are temporary. As soon as you catch up with technology, you can definitely get a job again. Seasonal unemployment. Again, economists are not worried about seasonal unemployment. Obviously, some people lose their jobs because of the changes in the weather, which is absolutely, again, normal. But we try actually to control and avoid dramatic changes in the cyclical unemployment. And as I said, during recession time, we will deal with cyclical unemployment rate, and the unemployment rate in general actually increases because of cyclical unemployment rate, and it's typically lower during expansion times. Okay. Um, Let me skip these. Now let's talk about full employment, which was kind of related to what I was explaining. Remember, if we don't have, if let's say we're not having recession, and the economy is healthy and booming and growing, but so it means that the cyclical unemployment rate is very low, it's close to zero, but we still are going to have seasonal unemployment. We still going to have a structural unemployment. We still have frictional unemployment because they are natural. So basically, um, we say that if the economy is healthy and if there is no cyclical unemployment rate, we still have some level of unemployment rate, and we're going to call that natural rate of unemployment or natural unemployment rate. Okay, so it does not mean that the unemployment rate is zero. The unemployment rate is still positive, and we call this situation that we are dealing with when there is no cyclical unemployment rate full employment. So full employment is basically at the times that the unemployment rate in the country is equal or very close to a natural rate of unemployment. And for United States, the natural unemployment rate is 5%. So whenever the unemployment rate, the actual unemployment rate is close to 5%, it shows that we are at full employment. Full employment is like the equilibrium we had in chapter 3. This is a place that a country, a macroeconomic basically want to be, because it's pretty stable. It tells us that the recession is not happening. It tells us that we are just dealing with normal changes in the job market. Okay, and the unemployment rate is very close to natural unemployment rate. Okay, so that's the place that we want our economy to be, at full employment. All right. And we have also one important terminology, and that we're going to use it in the future, but I just want you to take notes and be aware of that, which is called potential GDP. If the economy is at full employment, and we just define full employment, then the level of real GDP is called potential GDP. So potential GDP is basically just a number. So whenever the economy is at full employment, the real GDP will be called potential GDP, and is equal basically to potential GDP. And of course, because of the business cycle, because of constant changes in the economy in real GDP, definitely, we're not all the time at full employment. Remember that sometimes the real GDP might be greater than potential GDP. The actual real GDP might be greater than potential GDP. It can be less than potential GDP. Same thing for unemployment rate. Sometimes unemployment rate is greater than natural unemployment rate. Sometimes it's less than natural unemployment rate. Okay, it's because of the changes that we see in the business cycle. Okay, so obviously, if we're experiencing recession, then the actual unemployment rate will be greater than 5%, the natural unemployment rate. Obviously, the level of GDP will drop during recession time because the economy is slow. So the actual real GDP will be less than potential GDP, and vice versa. If the economy is growing and booming, then real GDP will be much greater than potential GDP, because we're able and capable of producing too much output, a lot of output, because we're expanding and growing. So obviously we have enough jobs for everybody. So the unemployment rate is sometimes even less than 5%, okay? Less than natural unemployment rate, all right? Can actually measure this changes in the real GDP. And we can basically look at the change between the actual GDP, the current GDP, and the potential GDP to also tell if we're experiencing recession or expansion. How? By calculating and using this formula, which is called GDP gap, another formula that I want you to remember. So GDP gap is the difference between actual GDP and potential GDP. Again, obviously, if we are talking about recession times, since actual GDP is going to be less than potential GDP, the GDP gap is going to be negative. And if we are experiencing expansion, it means that we're producing more output. So the actual GDP is greater than potential GDP. So the GDP gap will be positive. So you can look at basically the changes in GDP gap, the sign of GDP gap to tell if we're experiencing recession or expansion. You can look at the relationship between real GDP and potential GDP to see if the economy is experiencing recession or expansion, or you can look at the relationship between unemployment rate and natural unemployment rate. And again, see if the economy is booming and growing, or if we are struggling and we are basically dealing with slower economy and recession. Okay, that's pretty much it that you should remember and know for the first part of this chapter, which is about jobs and unemployment rate and all those things that we just discussed so far. The rest of the chapter is focused on inflation, okay? How we can calculate and measure inflation rate, and some other important terminologies when it comes to inflation, types of inflation, and so forth, okay? So let's just start by talking about CPI, or Consumer Price Index, that you probably heard about. And the most important application of CPI is calculating inflation rate, because when I show you the formula we have for inflation rate, you will see that we're going to use CPI. And again, remember that the Bureau of Labor Statistics is in charge of measuring CPI, which is cost of living, and using it to calculate inflation rate. So Consumer Price Index basically measures the average, as I put it here, the average prices that consumers basically pay for certain goods and services, we're calling it fixed market basket, which is nothing but basically the typical goods and services that consumers purchase and buy. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics collects the prices of all these goods and services that people use. They put them in this so-called basket. They have the prices. So when they want to calculate inflation rate, they're going to check the prices here. Okay. And remember, we had base year in chapter 7 when we were talking about real GDP and nominal GDP. We again kind of have a similar thing and concept here. We call it base period. So by definition, the CPI at the base period, which is over 2014, 2015, is 100. What does it mean? It means that the average prices that paid by consumers for this time period over 2014 and 2015 is basically 100. Okay. So anytime that we want basically to compare the CPI of, let's say, 2021 and see what happened to the cost of living, we can compare the CPI, current CPI, with this 100 and see basically how much the average prices changed, what happened to the consumer, basically cost of living. Okay. So this is the consumer price index. Okay. All right. So I put some examples for you here. So and this is how basically we can use that 100 for the CPI of the base period. So let's say the CPI in May 2018 was 194.4. What does it mean? First of all, this 194.4 means that the average prices that consumers paid for the fixed goods and number of goods and services that we put it in the market, in the basket of goods and services, was 94.4. Sorry, was 194.4. Okay, that was the average prices, and that's the cost of basically certain number of goods and services that we have in our basket. Okay. If you want to compare it with the base period, however, this number tells us that for the same number of goods and services that you paid 100 and the average prices was 100, right now you are paying 194.4 instead of 100. So the cost of living, or the average prices, went up by 94.4%. Okay, so in the other word, everything is more expensive in May 2018. By how much? By 94.4. So you're going to compare it with that 100, which was the CPI in the base period. And same thing here also for April 2018, that you can definitely do it on your own. These are the steps that Bureau of Labor Statistics takes to calculate CPI, which again is going to happen every single month, just like the unemployment rate. So they first collect those goods and services, and they define their basket of goods and services, or the CPI basket. And remember, we're talking about 2014, 2015, but we do have new goods and services that they didn't exist in 2014, 2015. Let's say iPhone 12. We didn't have it at that time, but we have it right now. So keep in mind that they adjust somehow for the new goods and services, and they try to it's one of the weaknesses of CPI, by the way, but they try actually to revise this basket every 2 years, and they try actually to cover and capture these the prices of these new products that they didn't exist in the base period. Okay, but remember, we constantly have new products and new services, and that's one of the weaknesses of CPI. But remember that the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates the CPI and inflation rate every single month. So it's really expensive and hard for them to capture all the goods and services that are out there. So they try action. It's easier for them to stick to the list of the goods and services they have and they define in the past. So that's the very first step for them to calculate CPI. Define this basket or the CPI basket. Then they have a survey, just like the unemployment, so that we had. So they have this monthly price survey. They again go to the market, they collect the prices of all the goods and services they have in their CPI basket, and then they have a little formula to calculate CPI. And this is just an example of CPI basket. So in the CPI basket, we have food, we have clothing, shelter, we have different types of services like education, healthcare, and with the information that they got from the market, they can calculate the CPI. And there are two different ways that we can actually look at this formula. And I got one from the textbook, our textbook, and another one from another textbook that I use mainly for my teaching. They're pretty much the same, but I just wanted to show you two different ways of, or two different formulas that are doing the same thing. So CPI is basically the cost of CPI basket at the current period prices, which is, let's say, right now for this month, divided by the cost of CPI at the base period. Okay, and they're going to multiply it by 100. That's another formula, another important formula we have. But for the test, I'm not going to ask you to calculate CPI. The only thing I want you to calculate is inflation rate, and I will give you the CPI. So you really don't have to go through the calculation of CPI, but just know the steps that Bureau of Labor Statistics takes to calculate the CPI. But I'm not going to actually ask you to calculate CPI for me. And this is just an example. You can read it on your own. It's just basically plugging numbers, okay? But the important application of CPI, as I mentioned, is to calculate the inflation rate. Inflation rate, and this is a very important definition, is the percentage change in the price level from one year to another year. There is a difference between price and price level. When we say price, we're talking about the price of, let's say, Apple. It's just one product. But when we say price level, we're talking about that average prices that CPI is capturing, average prices of all the goods and services we have in the CPI basket, or the basket of goods and services that Bureau of Labor Statistics basically has. Okay, so be careful. It's price level. It's not the price of one single product, because we're talking about the inflation rate for the entire goods and services for our country. So the formula is very important. And this is another formula you need to know. And since we're talking about the percentage change, obviously you should look at the difference between the CPI of the current year. Let's say your current year is 2021 minus the CPI of the previous year, 2020, divided by the CPI in previous year, 2020. And it's a percentage change, so you have to multiply it by 100. Okay, so the definition and the formula for inflation rate are very, very important. Now let's look at two important terminologies we have here. The first one is called hyperinflation, which is basically when the inflation rate is pretty high and it's going up very fast, and it's typically more than 50%. Okay. And yes, we had countries like Brazil that deal with hyperinflation in the past, and it's basically when you have a outrageous um, inflation rate that the Federal Reserve or the central bank in that country cannot basically control. And consumers and producers are both very confused. They don't know how much they should pay for the product because the prices are changing every single minute, um, every hour. So that's the situation that some countries actually experienced in the past. Okay, and these are the examples of those countries. Okay. Another important definition here or terminology is deflation, which is kind of the opposite of hyperinflation. And remember, when we have hyperinflation, the inflation rate is greater than 50%, right? But here, when we talk about deflation, deflation is when an inflation rate actually is negative, meaning that the price level actually is going down in a country. Okay, it means that everything is becoming cheaper and cheaper every day. And Japan actually, I can't remember, it was after 2015 that experienced deflation. But we also had Switzerland, we had Spain, that they all dealt with deflation. So we had negative inflation rate. So everything was basically cheaper in the current year compared to the previous year, if you want to go back to the formula and check it out. Okay. Now let's talk about types of inflation. We have two different types of inflation. The first one is called demand pull inflation, and it's kind of related, both of them, both of these types of inflation, to what we discussed in chapter 3. You can go back and look at the changes in demand and supply. So demand pull inflation is when the prices are going up because of the increase in demand. Remember, we were keeping the supply fixed and we were shifting the demand to the right. The result was higher prices, right? So that's exactly what this demand pull inflation is about. So you'll see the higher prices because of higher demand, okay? And cost push inflation is when the prices are going up because of the changes in the supply. Again, in chapter 3, if you remember, we kept the demand fixed and then we decreased the supply and then we saw the drop in prices, right? So that's exactly what's happening here. So cost push inflation is when the prices are changing because of the changes in supply. Okay, so these are the two different types of um, um, inflation we have. All right, so that's it for this chapter. Um, and I hope that you find it helpful. Remember, you will have all the formulas. Just make sure you know how to use them. Take notes, have them ready when you are taking the exam, and have some practice. Try to plug some numbers, see how you can calculate the percentage changes, unemployment rate, and so forth. I also, as always, have short videos for you on D2L for this week. Check them out, where I basically showed you how you can use all these formulas. All right, till next time.